right, thank you very much. Welcome to our esteemed panelists today. Dr. Waheed unfortunately had some flight problems getting here, so we have these three esteemed panelists. We wish Dr. Waheed all the best, hopefully getting here, although I think the ship has sailed. So, all right, so welcome everyone. We just heard some really interesting ways to think about treating dry AMD, and I wanted to really ask, the disease itself can be broken down in terms of the pathology, to early stage, intermediate stage, and later stage. And I just wanted to ask the panel, to each of you, to speak about some of the hurdles in treating such a diverse patient population.
I'll be happy to start off. We all have patients who have varying degrees of age-related macular degeneration in their eyes, whether it's dry or wet, early, intermediate, or advanced dry. It's exciting that we're about to potentially have one or two new therapies in 2023. The question is, how are we going to apply those? Although it's exciting that we have it for this condition that can maybe thwart the rate of progression of geographic atrophy, it would be great if we could intervene much earlier in the disease process, like we do with the AREDS vitamins over the last 15, 20 years or so that we've been doing that. So I think that that's going to be something that is a huge unmet need right now, but we're taking a baby step forward with having this first-in-class therapy.
Yeah, I think, we've been doing some work with the genetics, and this may not be one disease. We think it is. But when you genetically type people, you find that they have different combinations of different genes. Not all the genes are known. There are clearly other factors. So it shouldn't surprise us that the treatment response is going to be heterogeneous as well. I think we have to be very careful with this because you're treating a chronic disease that may not progress very quickly, and all treatments have side effects, and we're seeing that in these clinical trials. So when you're looking at making a small difference in progression of an area that still doesn't affect the patient's vision, and yet you may have an increase, even though a small increase of CNV and other complications, it becomes very tricky to decide what to approve and what doesn't. This is not an easy disease. None of these drugs are home run. We're not seeing the GA go away. We're not, seeing photobiomodulation, taking 2,200 patients and making it 20/20. So you're talking about small improvements in a heterogeneous disease, and it's very complicated.
Yeah, and I want to echo what Dr. Freeman had just mentioned, because it is a very heterogenic disease, and this makes, especially creating clinical trials, a very difficult task. You have to really be very savvy when you choose what kind of inclusion criteria you're using, as well as throughout the trial. You really want to have as many phenotypes potentially of this disease included in the clinical trial. So I really admire all the efforts that all the previous companies that have shared with us all these incredible presentations, because it is a very difficult task. It's a very, very heterogenic disease.
Thank you. Speaking of the different stages of dry AMD, a lot of the treatments that we hear about are injections into the eye. And when someone is losing their vision and their physician shares with them a therapeutic that can really help immediately, that's just, it's a game changer immediately. With dry AMD, you can have it and not know it. You can have it and go to your physician and be told that, in the near future, you may lose vision, but in the moment, their vision's okay. So can you all speak to how to communicate that with patients who may not, who need treatment, but may not be willing to get an injection?
Well, so currently we don't really have that problem because we're not treating asymptomatic, as you explained. So this is going to be a major issue, and I think at some point, even in the US, we're going to start doing what they've done in the UK with the so-called NICE program. I'm not an advocate of this, but basically they weigh the cost, and they say, if you reduce GA progression by 17%, and that will save vision loss, let's say 8 years down the road, but it requires a lot of compliance and it requires $60,000 a year of treatment. Do we do this or not? And one of the problems is if you approve a marginal therapy, all of a sudden the impetus for innovation kind of goes away because there's already an approved drug. So this just isn't easy. And Andrew, I don't know what you think, but we're not seeing any home runs yet, right?
Not yet. I think that this is analogous to using anti-VEGF monotherapy for the treatment of diabetic retinopathy without diabetic macular edema. Those patients don't really have a lot of symptoms, if any, until they develop either vitreous hemorrhage or they develop diabetic macular edema, at which point they're raising their hands and trying to get in as quickly as possible for a treatment. So it is similar to that. And the question is, are we providing enough of a benefit with these injections? I think the patient who may appreciate this, and this has been talked about at other meetings, is the patient who has already suffered vision loss in one eye from dry macular degeneration with center involving geographic atrophy. And now they're afraid the same thing's going to happen to the second eye, and then maybe they have a juxtafoveal lesion or extrafoveal GA lesion that might benefit from this treatment. I think that's like the low-hanging fruit patient bucket of patients to go after. But even that patient is, just sort of taking it on faith that this may be helping them. But that might be the easiest patient to elect to sign up for this therapy when it becomes available.
So Andrew, this is one of the reasons that some companies are focusing on oral therapy or subcutaneous. The problem with that is that when you affect the immune system in some way, in some of these clinical trials, they have to be vaccinated from meningococcus or pneumococcus, and there's a clear systemic risk of these diseases. So the compliance is easier, right? But you're treating a local disease with a systemic therapy that has implications.
No, that's a great point and not to be underestimated.
Anyone?
Yeah, so especially companies that are focusing on this kind of approaches, it's very important for them to create awareness and also to build that educational material. They're all working in this with the scientific community. So we need to start also asking for these companies to also help us with that educational material, videos and things to really help educate ourselves and also patients. With that content, it will be much easier to really reach out. If it's a very simple message, patients will definitely understand.
Yeah, but right now, the message isn't simple. This will reduce your GA growth rate by 21.24%. It may not affect your visual acuity. It might at some point in the future, but it may actually increase the risk of endophthalmitis. There's some data with that, with certain drugs, and it may cause choroidal neovascularization, even though that CNV may not immediately threaten your vision. This is hard for us to weigh as retina specialists, and for a patient to understand this may be complicated.
And I would add to that and say it kind of turns us into glaucoma specialists in the sense that, the first hurdle I talked about was getting patients to agree to sign up for the therapy. But once they sign up for it, then we have to get them to stay on the therapy. With wet AMD, there's a positive feedback mechanism. Their fluid comes back, we give them an injection, the fluid goes away, they see better. So they're appreciating the efficacy of the drug. With this, there is no positive feedback mechanism. It's other than, staving off the development of GA, which is difficult for a patient to wrap their head around. So we know from glaucoma that it's very difficult for patients to stay on to be adherent to the treatment regimen. So we're going to start seeing patients, I suspect, dropping off of adherence to their monthly or bi-monthly injections, which they really need in order to get the efficacy.
So Andrew makes a really important point, which is compliance, or basically, will the patient take the drug? And even in wet AMD, when they do kind of see a drop in vision, when they skip a couple of visits, even in that disease, nobody in the real world is doing monthly injections or Q8 injections if it's indicated. The patients are all being underdosed to varying degrees. And what we don't know from the clinical trials is if you do underdose inadvertently, is the drug going to work? What will the complication rate be? Manuel, I know you can speak to how careful Genentech is when they do clinical trials. They make sure the patients come in at the correct interval. But in the real world, we have to accept that's not going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. So real world data is very different to what actually we see in the clinical trials. So it's a big challenge when we need to really understand the compliance of patients in the real world, and we do see different results. So yeah, it's a big challenge once the drug's in the market and we start seeing kind of a very different kind of population and behavior using now the drug. A good example, I think, about an indication that resembles a little bit this is, for example, diabetic retinopathy. So do you treat diabetic retinopathy? Most of us, we tend to observe diabetic retinopathy, but there's potentially some benefit of maybe start treating early diabetic retinopathy. But so it's kind of a similar debate. Should we treat before actually consequences or complications start? And it's something that might be or might require additional understanding.
Just wanted to ask Bill, you said that when a drug like this gets approved, that's going to be a barrier for additional innovation. I would think it would be the opposite. Wouldn't it be that
when
they're
I
opening
talk
the door?
when I talk to business people, they look now and they say there's no treatment for the disease. In that sense, this is great. We could be the first. If there are 2 or 3 or 4 approved treatments with different mechanisms, but they're out there already, that's eating into the market. So then you've got to show that you're better than. Yeah, and it's not only differentiated, you have to be better or more convenient. So in that sense, it's more difficult. That's why we heard Claire say there's no treatment for this. And disappointingly, the AREDS protocol, while we all use it, over time, it's become clear that for geographic atrophy, it doesn't work. The NEI folks tell me when they look back over the data, it's more effective very early in the disease than once people lose vision. Mm-hmm. So you have a common disease, it's very heterogeneous, but a common disease with no treatment. And a lot of business people would say, that's why I'm going to enter that space.
Well, the complexities continue when you have patients with both wet and dry AMD. Can you all speak to what those conversations look like?
Well, and actually some of these treatments may give them both wet and dry AMD. And this is not unanticipated. When you play games with the complement system, having an increased risk of endophthalmitis, although not a big increase, is something that one could anticipate. And changing the inflammatory cascade and causing CNV. And we're involved in one of the trials where when that started happening, we were told, don't worry, we don't think this affects visual acuity ultimately. And if you get CNV, this is the treatment regimen you're going to use, and you're going to be treating both diseases in one eye. So that is going to happen, and it may happen more with certain complement inhibitors.
Yeah, and it's felt that a lot of the CNV that's seen in those studies is not the aggressive type of CNV that we see de novo absent complement inhibition. So the question is, do we need to treat it that aggressively, or can we allow some of that CNV to maybe nourish the damaged macula?
Good luck on that. I mean, we were told, I believe, you need to treat it. This is the drug we want you to use for consistency. Sure. And I think the companies have to mitigate against the possibility. In animal models, when you laser-induce CNV, as you know well, it goes away on its own. And it could be that this drug-induced does do that, but I don't know that anyone's going to want to find out, certainly until their drug is approved.
And then from a logistics perspective, I think that, we all, even though it's not super common, we do see patients with wet AMD who, especially ones we've been treating for a long time, develop center-threatening geographic atrophy. We don't know what the FDA labels of these drugs may look like. Will we be able to use these complement inhibitors in those patients? Will we even want to consider doing it? If so, how would we apply the injections? Do the two drugs interact with each other? So there's a lot of questions there, because if these drugs really are effective at substantially prolonging center involvement of GA, we don't want to sort of withhold them from patients that may benefit from them just because they have wet AMD.
So this is very important, because a space, I don't particularly like the word, but a space that's being ignored is post-treatment GA. And there is a concern that this may be related to overdosing with anti-VEGF drugs. A couple of clinical trials have shown that a more aggressive anti-VEGF drug regimen, although effective, is associated with more geographic atrophy. And we're seeing a lot of patients who've been successfully treated with, your favorite choice of anti-VEGF. The disease is in remission. You're giving it every 8 or 10 or 12 weeks, or you may give them a holiday, and they're losing vision from progressive GA. I don't know if that is or isn't treatable. I suspect no one's going to want to go there until a drug is approved. But there's a lot of problems. Manuel, you saw a lot of these cases when you worked with me. Well, the post-treatment GA.
Yeah, I recall, Dr. Freeman. So right now, an interesting focus or an interesting kind of update going on with newer therapies for neovascular AMD is they're trying to focus on less treatment burden. So these new therapies are potentially lasting longer with one single injection. So there's kind of a focus on trying to decrease or lower kind of that anti-VEGF, as well as a newer mechanism of action also with the same medication. So there's new therapies that potentially could help us address this, but something that, as Dr. Freeman mentioned, we might start learning later on.
Yeah, we have time for just another couple questions. I want to get your thoughts on the clinical endpoints that are currently used to define success in clinical trials, and if you feel, how well that equates to vision improvements that will be meaningful for this patient population.
So the issue of endpoints is very important, because the FDA traditionally said it's vision. And in the era of CMV retinitis, they really, even then, didn't want to accept retinal destruction, even though you could photograph it. And at that time, they wanted visual fields done on patients with peripheral CMV retinitis. So when people started to look at GA, the question is, we can't really show a vision improvement. We can show potentially a reduction in central vision loss, but that's going to take a very long time. So people are looking at autofluorescence, other kinds of fundus imaging, microperimetry. We're doing work with AI, trying to overlay all these different types of tests into one analyzable database. And I think the FDA, and I suspect that maybe one or two of you aren't enamored with the FDA. Any hands? Okay. But actually, their job is to try to give everyone endpoints that make sense, And as you're hearing, even though to us, the lesion's not getting bigger is a positive thing, the patient may ask, well, what does that mean? So you could tell them, look, this blank spot in your vision on the microperimeter, you can't see over there, even though you're seeing surgery, that hasn't enlarged. And maybe we need to even show patients their microperimetry results. There's a technique we published on about 12 years ago, entoptic perimetry, where you're looking at basically snow on a big television screen, and you can see your scotomas in the mid-periphery, because you can't suppress the scotoma, but we may need a way to show patients. So to me, if the GA is not progressing, and in the other group, in the untreated group, it does progress, that's good enough for me. but it's a very strange endpoint to explain to a patient. But I think it's a reasonable endpoint, and you have to be fair and give that same endpoint to all the drugs.
So what do you think about, Stealth recently showed that ellipsoid zone loss was favored with their medication, active treatment versus sham, not in the area of the GA, but just in the central 6 millimeters of the macula. Thoughts on that as a potential future endpoint?
I mean, first you'd have to show that that's translatable into vision loss, that it's reproducible. But you would think that an early or more subtle endpoint over time would translate to a more obvious endpoint, right? I mean, you really have to, eventually, your drug has to stop central vision loss. You can't be, it's like you give a treatment for osteoporosis and you get your bone densitometry and the technician says, oh, it's the same. Well, you've got to show eventually that stops hip fractures, right? And I think this is difficult because these trials may really require 3, 4, 5 years to really show this. And it may be just too expensive to do it.
Manuel?
So something interesting regarding AI and, for example, deep learning. All these previous trials that have happened already that are focused on geographic atrophy, we were learning a lot because all these images, all the information we have been collected are actually giving us a lot of data regarding potential biomarkers. It's just a matter of kind of looking into ways of really validate this and correlate this with vision and try to understand much better all this. And I think deep learning and AI is really, really giving us some hints on this. I can give you an example from our own company, from Genentech. We had a trial with the lampalizumab drug. It was it did not meet the primary objective. But we learn a lot. It's a lot of data that we have there and that we are currently using to really be able to learn about, first, a lot of characteristics from patients that really potentially could put them at a higher risk or a higher development of the disease. So we're learning a lot of that. And I do think that all these companies that also have this not positive outcomes could also benefit from looking into this kind of outcomes. Biomarkers.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the panel again for a very lively discussion. Thanks again very much.